Hey, Bill, I do have a question for
Yeah,
you.
sure.
So, having gone to, seen a lot of these and seen you in person talk about this, the various fairs, what is the difference between a World's Fair and an exposition?
Well, somebody asked that, sent me an email or something about it the other day. Basically, you have the Bureau of International Expositions in Paris, and they charter expositions. But at some point, people were calling them World's Fairs. To me, it's interchangeable. A World's Fair, like some of them have actually even been, the Louisiana World's Exposition, the 1984 New Orleans World's Fair. It used both names. So they're really pretty much the same. What the BIE though does is they have different categories of expositions and certain rules. If you're a class one, it can only be held, I think it's every 10 years, a class two, and then they have specialized. And I can't pretend I remember all of their particular designations. So they have, again, if you want to do a big flower show, you can do that as a specialized exposition. They have it on their website of how they decide for it. But to me, I'm not a purist. I call them all World's Fairs or Expos. And, if I'm getting it wrong and I owe somebody a royalty fee for using the wrong fee, they can try to get it from me.
All right, thank you.
Sure. So again, I'm recording this. If anybody doesn't want to be seen on camera, you can, blank yourself out. If anybody has a question that absolutely has to be answered during it, or if you find I'm making a tremendous mistake, please let me know. Otherwise, questions at the end just make it a little bit easier for me to keep up a pace on this. So appreciate folks joining us. Spokane is a real interesting World's Fair. It was, I think, the smallest one ever held. And it's an interesting situation where everybody proclaimed, you're too small, you're never going to get the audience, you're never going to make this work. And they made it work, and they made it work quite well. So let me just get my pictures ready here. 1 second. And okay. I will now see, I will back here and share. We don't have any sound this week, so I did not have to worry about making my usual mistake and not clicking the sound on. But let me go here. Okay, does everybody see the giant ticket for the World's Fair? Okay,
Yes.
great. So the Spokane World's Fair or Expo 74, as somebody just asked, what's the difference? You can see right here to Spokane was the same thing. It was licensed as the Expo 74, was billed as World's Fair, and it was held for 6 months in 1974. So this is, I always get a kick, when people have these tickets for sale on eBay or whatever. It's like, you had this ticket, why didn't you go? And when I was cleaning up my parents' house years ago, my mom had some tickets to the World's Fair. And it was like, what was she saving them for? She never went. So, but luckily, some people save these as souvenirs. But for $4, you got a day at the World's Fair. Then they had different prices for children. When they mentioned grounds open 10 a.m. To 10 p.m., at 10 p.m. you could actually come in for $1 and go to the amusement area because all the pavilions were closed. And if you were really rich, you could spend $45 and get a season pass to go to the fair. So it was a real bargain when you look at today's prices for things. So this is the site for the fair. And this will sound a little bit like broken record from past talks. Gee, I want to have a World's Fair. Where do I want to put it? Oh, I want to go find a polluted railroad yard, and I want to go build a World's Fair on top of it. And that's exactly what happened in Spokane. This is an island, and I'll probably mispronounce it, Havermale Island in the middle there. You can see a train station with a tower sticking up and a bunch of roads going on. This was an absolutely polluted and rundown part of town. At one point, there were four or five different railroads that served the area, and they came in here. You can see some of the train tracks or the remnants, some at the top end of the picture, empty ground where the terminal used to serve traffic. But it was really run down. I think the only thing that was still going on the island at this point of any note was a large laundry, but it had been terribly polluted over the years. They wanted to do something with it, and they came up with the idea of the World's Fair. They also wanted to build a new opera house. They figured that they needed a way to raise money. They used the World's Fair for that. There was a historic carousel they wanted to find a new home for. They decided to use the World's Fair for that. So they came up with the idea of doing the World's Fair, and this was really done at the proverbial last minute. They started working on the fair, and this was a concept art for it. They didn't get their charter from the BIE until 1971. So they only had 3 years from the time that they got the go ahead to do the fair to they actually got to opening day, which, when you think about it, is a tremendous amount of work to do in a very short period of time. Designing the fair, building the fair, just signing up licenses, that sort of thing. But this was what they initially thought how that polluted island would end up looking. They set out to try to come up with a theme structure for the fair. And this was going to be a restaurant that rotated. Since Seattle had one, they had to have one. And it was going to be on these jets of water that would mask the pillars holding the building up. So the concept with this restaurant floating on this giant torrent of water coming down. They were not able to get the money for it, and as a result, they never really had a theme structure for this particular World's Fair. There was no Eiffel Tower, there was no Sun Sphere, there was no Unisphere, because they had basically bet the farm on this being the theme structure, and it fell through too late in the game to come up with a replacement. But they started working. They started tearing down everything on the island that they could. At this particular point, they're tearing down the train station that was there for everything except the tower. And one of the things they did was put up the numbers in the tower to tell you how many days until opening day. So here we're looking 450 days away from the opening of the fair. No elevator in that tower, so somebody had the job every day of climbing up those steps and changing the numbers. But for amateur historians like me, it's a wonderful way to actually be able to date a photo every time you see it with those numbers up there. So again, they're just going crazy getting this thing done. 1 year to go, and you can still see what the site looked like. And I mean, it's just twisted metal, ruined stuff, just a real mess. That tower, by the way, they were really looking forward to having it be a integral part of the fair, and having it chime it had bell tower, so it had chimes up there. And unfortunately, about the time this picture was taken, some thieves got up there and they stole some of the brass workings of the clock. I guess just go and melt them down. So they were thinking for a while that they were not going to be able to actually have the clock tower operational. But they found the plans for this tower, which had been built, I think it was in the turn of the century. They found them in a local museum. A bunch of union guys at a machine shop and some college students got together, handmade some new replacement parts, and the bells are still chiming today. So they're working away, clearing this ground, and they ended up with a real problem on their hand, well into the construction. This whole fair had been billed as an environmental fair. If you think back to the days of 1974, the ecology was brand new. It was one of the first times of Earth Day. Recycling was just coming into play. And the fair had to take all these many tons of polluted dirt off there and get rid of them. And they just announced they were going to go dump it someplace. And environmentalists, rightfully so, said, hey, you can't take your contaminated dirt and dump it over here, which is not contaminated. You're just taking your problem and making it our problem. So they had to come up with a very expensive plan on how they were going to mitigate this, take the pollutants out, safely encapsulate the dirt. And they were so busy with it, it really held things up. And that's why 1 year from construction, 1 year from opening day, rather, they were still very late in construction because they almost had their plans derailed. But we're working away 220 days from construction. For my friends at Disney, you can imagine how do you feel if you were working on, say, Epcot, and you're only 220 days away, and this is the state of your site. That big semicircular area up on the left is going to become the United States Pavilion. Other things they were doing was building man-made mountains so they could bury highways under it so they could still get traffic through it. Because that was one of the interesting things. They had to build this World's Fair with a city that still needed to get from one side of the city to the other through the middle of the construction zone. So they came up with a logo here. This is going to be all set for when they open this up. And the logo here, I'll just read my note, expresses the continuity of life, a Mobius strip of man's inescapable relationship with all things in his immediate environment and his total universe. So we have blue for water, green for the things that grow, and the white, hopefully, for the clear skies. And this is what we'll be talking about. It's a map of the grounds. And in my book, I mentioned that this map had to be very confusing to most people because if you look at the little insert legend, for some reason it did north on the bottom. And whoever does maps with north on the bottom, but I guess they figured this looked prettier for some reason. I've turned it around and looked at it upside down, and to me it looked just as good. But for whatever reason, they decided to go with a northern map or another map. So finally, we're at day 0. The clock tower is ready to go. We're ready for opening day. They built stages out into the river because they had so many dignitaries that wanted to make so many speeches that they couldn't fit them all up on the main stage. President Nixon came out and he gave a talk on letting the fair open. They let 1,974 trout out into the river to celebrate the fact that the river had now been cleaned up for the fair. And they also let 50,000 balloons go. And that's something today with environmentalists, you would not be able to let out 50,000 balloons because we all know that they do bad things to the animals that eat them. And I was part of a couple big balloon releases at Disneyland, and it's amazing how far people would call and say, "Hey, I got one of your balloons here in Idaho or something." So they go pretty far, but we're not going to see a pretty picture like that for a while. But now the fair is open, and they had built some of the walkways like this around the site. There were some existing bridges, but they built some of these others around. And one thing that is interesting, this is a picture real close to opening day. They did not put a lot of fencing around the river. It was just a river, go down and enjoy it. Well, all of a sudden, people bringing school groups down there were having kids getting very, very close to the water. And as you can see, this is not a gentle, placid stream running through the site. So the Fair Corporation had to run around and throw up fencing all over the place. First, just chain link fencing, and then others more natural looking things. But happily, no reports of anybody falling in. One of the things the fair did that worked well in one regard and not well in another was they went with very, very wide walkways. If you look at this, it's a very non-congested area. And as a result, it was easy for people to get from point A to point B. However, when initial photos of the site came out and they were showing pictures like this, people were saying, "Hey, nobody's going." Well, it turned out the crowds were pretty much what had been predicted. The fair did do well financially, but the first reaction, it started off doing pretty well. The press came out and said, "Hey, nobody's going." Then people said, "Oh, if nobody's going, it must be a bust. I won't go." So the fair had to do a lot of corrective action to make sure everybody knew that it was a success, that people were going, that it was being a popular fair. One other thing you might notice in this is that there are no street lights. If you look down, there's a guy in a red hat back there, and he's walking by a metal pole. They went with very low lighting down to the ground, again, to make this a very non-visual polluting environment. They didn't want the pole sticking up during the day and being ugly. They didn't want to have it too bright at night. And it turned out working out very well. It gave it much of a more park-like atmosphere. What was interesting, though, is they had to go and work in the fact that part of the island was already a hydroelectric plant. They weren't going to be able to get rid of it. So here you have the building in the back with the people on it is part of the Australia Pavilion, just built for the fair. And right next to it is a hydroelectric power plant built in 1922. And they tried to do what they could with planters and different fencing and that to mask some of these things off. But there were parts of the thing that you just can't get rid of a hydroelectric plant that the city needs to keep the lights on. You also couldn't get rid of the fact that you had a road running smack dab through the middle of it. So again, they tried to do as much as they could to masquerade it with trees and berms and things like that. But it was a fair that lived inside the city. And as a result, what also happened is all these people that were driving through it now saw the fair. You could see the people on the overhead tram ride. You could see people walking around. That all helped tremendously with word of mouth and public interest as it went through. So again, the existing waterworks are there, but let's put up some, trees, cover it, nice wooden walkways, and it's a very, you're to me at least when I look at this, my eyes are driven to the greenery of it, not so much the power plant that's sitting in the background. So what they did was they designed 5 different zones of the fair, 5 different gates. They did colors, and they put up these giant butterflies, and they were visible from a pretty good distance. So if you knew you were parked in the lilac zone or the red zone or whatever, and that's the gate you wanted to come in and go out of, you had these butterflies as ways to try to attract you and go around. They also had fence posts that these are all pretty much a generic shape and figures, but they were wildly decorated for the various exhibits. The one on the left was outside the corporate headquarters. The one in the center is a salute to the BIE, the governing body. And then, of course, the one over in the right, Germany, is sort of self explanatory. They also had to deal with, what do we do with this bridge? This bridge is the Howard Street Mid-Channel Bridge, built in 1909. They needed to get people from point A to B. First of all, they didn't have money to tear it down. Second, it was a historic bridge they didn't want to tear down. And third, they needed to get people to the other side, but it was kind of an ugly railroad bridge. So they went off and they took a page out of the books of places like Venice and some of these others. They put shops along it. You can see those little buildings with the triangular roofs. They put colored panels on it to kind of draw your eyes away from the fact that it was a big metal bridge. And it became a successful shopping experience as people walked their way across the bridge. I got a kick out of this one for an environmental fair. They had a bee infestation, and everybody wandering around, and the beekeepers are out there trying to take them away. I'm sure they did it in a ecologically friendly manner. They took the concept of passports, which had been introduced in Expo 67, and brought it here again to Expo 74. And it was a big hit. You could go around and get your stamps put in there and try to collect it. This gives you an idea of some of what you'd see there, that it truly was a World's Fair. You had several international exhibits. You had some other ones up at the top, the Union Pacific Railroad, some commercial stuff. But this had a pretty good international presence for such a tiny, small little World's Fair. This here is called the Passport, sorry, the Plaza of Nations. It was the flags of all the nations who were participating at the fair. And it's interesting, in the fair records, when they were summarizing, they mentioned for some reason people kept coming and stealing the flag of the Soviet Union, and that all the other flags remained pretty much intact throughout the year. A few had to be replaced because they got worn for weather, but somewhere out there has 6 flags from the Soviet Union for some reason. They either really liked or really didn't like the Soviet Union. Well, let's start taking a little tour around. You have Alberta and British Columbia were here for Canada. Originally, you were supposed to have a massive Canadian pavilion. It was supposed to be all of Canada, and funding fell through. So it looked for a while that Canada was not going to be there at the fair, but these 2 provinces decided that they were going to participate. So British Columbia did a lot celebrating native art that was done up there. They had some totem pole carvers that worked on site, and the totem pole that they carved in Expo 74 is still on site today. And over for Alberta, they built an amphitheater for $150,000 to do street performances. Musicians, traveling ones that came in. This fellow happens to be a mime that heard that there was an opportunity, came up from Los Angeles and spent a portion of the summer performing there. And I talked to him, and he was just absolutely raving about what a wonderful experience he had up there. This was another thing that was out on the island, the Canadian Island Playground, and there were a number of these figures. And what's interesting is all of these are built from recycled materials. Old wagon wheels, most of the wood here came from recycled pallets. Old buildings have been torn down. Again, the fair was very, very based around the idea of ecology and man living within and not destroying his environment. Big area also out there was the Northwest. This was interesting. It was the first time the Smithsonian Institution had ever sponsored an exhibit at World's Fairs. And again, they wanted to celebrate the Native American tribes that lived in the area. They did an awful lot of dances. They had things on their culture. The people that had been there before the city was founded by the white men that came out. So very well received area. They did about, I think, 6 different shows a day out there of different performers. So it was pretty well frequented by guests, because if you came in the morning, there was a good reason to go back in the afternoon and another reason to go back in the evening, because the shows were all different. But as World's Fair, it's great to have world exhibits. This was Japan. They had a very large size pavilion, this little tranquil garden area outside. And one of the things they were talking about was Japan is very populated in the cities. You tend to have everybody concentrated in several small parts of the city. And how were they in 1974 foreseeing the future for expanding growth to be able to house more people, but also not defoliate the rest of the islands, which were still, in a natural sort of habitat, and how they were going to come up with more efficient means of transportation, trash recycling, disposal, that sort of thing. The pavilion, this is the Philippines pavilion. They're doing a dance which is called the ticklet dance, and as I understand it, it's how they use these poles here to catch the feet of birds. And I guess the trick of the dance is the faster you dance and the tighter they try to get the poles in there. But Philippines had a nice pavilion, and out back they had a snack bar. And I show this because it's interesting that, unlike a lot of other World's Fairs, there were not a lot of national restaurants in the pavilions. The USSR had one that was very popular, but most of the pavilions were cultural displays, business displays, and they didn't go a lot for fine restaurants, because they realized in their planning documents, you can read in, that they're saying that people come to a World's Fair, they're there to be entertained, and they don't go to the restaurants. If you're spending 4 hours or 3 hours or 2 hours or whatever at a restaurant, you're not seeing the fair. This also, because this was just across the river from the city, it was a conscious effort by the planners not to take away the restaurant trade from the restaurants in the main city. So what they suggested was you could come to the fair, you could walk across the bridge, have a nice meal over there, come back over, see the fair, or you could just go to a snack bar. So very, very few actual restaurants on the fair grounds. Most of them, again, these little snack bars. Germany had an interesting pavilion. They took a very interesting approach. They admitted, man, did we screw up? We have polluted massive amounts of Germany, both getting ready for World War II, during the war, and now recovering from the war and our rush to rebuild our industry. So they really threw themselves on the sword, and they had displays inside. They had 18 different screens showing how Germany was making a conscious effort to be a better partner of the world community and look less to their industrial side, but also now more to the future and how they were going to succeed. Australia had a great exhibit. Inside, you could see a very large glass model of the New Sydney Opera House. And it's strange when you think about the New Sydney Opera House. To me, the Sydney Opera House has just always been there. No, in 1974 was new. The other great thing that Australia did at that point was they had Australia Day, and at the new Spokane Opera House, Helen Reddy came in, and she was absolutely at the top of the charts back then. They had Helen Reddy Day, and she was very, very well received. And they were very, very proud that she was conquering the American music charts, because if you think about it, not many Australian performers do. South Korea had, and again, this is Republic of Korea. There was North Korea generally does not participate in a lot of World's Fairs, and up at this point, none. But they had these little wind chimes that you can see some of them glistening in the sun, and you could hear these quite a distance. It was across the river on a bridge, but even over the water, you could hear these. So a very nice way of giving people an incentive to look their way, come on over and see what was going on. Inside, in the back, you can see the development plan, all sorts of things on industrial things that Korea was doing. But they had periodic displays of Taekwondo. They had all these musical performers, dance performers. And as the picture shows, it was very well received. It was probably one of the more popular international pavilions in terms of audience attendance. Some that you don't expect to see, Iran was there. Kind of an interesting thing. Iran actually had their pavilion built by a team of 15 Czechoslovakians that came over, because Iran was not having the best of relationships with America at the time. But they came over, built the pavilion over there, and they had, again, like everybody else, displays on why their businesses are good, why their cultures are good. but they had a puppet show about the environment, and it turned out to be a very popular show because with so much emphasis on the environment, there wasn't a lot in the fair outside of the entertainment, the amusement zone for kids. So when all of a sudden you get to take a kid to a very popular 18-minute or so puppet show, it was very well received and often long lines to get into the puppets. Plaza Mexicana was a real last minute kludge. It was supposed to be a very elegant pavilion sponsored by the Mexican government that had proclaimed they were bringing a massive display of pre Columbian art, and it was going to really put Mexico on the cultural map. Well, I've never been able to see exactly why, but at the very last minute, the government of Mexico dropped out, said we just can't fund it. And the building's already being built. So now what do they do? So, like other World's Fairs, a bunch of Mexican businesses got together and sponsored exhibits here in it. So there was not so much here. They took out the plant artwork. They put in a big restaurant, and there were some other small minor displays. But this was kind of a last minute hodgepodge put together, and it was a pretty good sized building. So it's really great they were able to come up with a salvage plan because otherwise they would have had a problem on their side. China was there, and again, this is not mainland China, who is not exhibiting at fairs at the time. This was just about the time that Nixon was doing his breakthrough negotiations with China and opening up trade. But this is Taiwan, Formosa, the Republic of China, and they had a very big multimedia display with 16 millimeter projectors, slide projectors, everything all synchronized together for a big display on life there. They also had a dance troupe that would march through the grounds, perform, and sort of like the Pied Piper, march around, have everybody follow them, and of course you can imagine where they ended up back at their pavilion. USSR had a very large pavilion here, 52,000 square feet, as a matter of fact. Very popular, and it was a very interesting thing because they had to get visas to come over here and work at it. And some of the stuff sounds silly today, but the Cold War is still going on, and the Russians were not allowed to go with. They had a certain boundary that they could go. I forget how many miles it was, but they couldn't go outside that boundary. And they were complaining about, the imperialistic Americans restraining them to this area. And one of the things was that they also complained that there was an Air Force base nearby. And this is no joke. They formally complained when they were building their pavilion that the American planes were sending spy planes over the USSR pavilion to spy on them as they were building it. And, not that people didn't trust each other in 1974, but they just didn't trust each other. So the lots of politics going on, but the USSR pavilion became pretty popular because it had a very popular restaurant. And the Russians that worked there basically would challenge all the people that worked in every other pavilion to try to drink them under the table. And it's my understanding that the USSR's team successfully held their record by the end of end of the expo. That lots of people from different pavilions talked about going over there and meeting their match. But when you walked in, it was typical heavy-handed sort of stuff. A big thing of Lenin, who the USSR was saying was an absolutely wonderful environmentalist, which I never knew up to that point in time. That his whole thing was about trying to make the USSR a workers' paradise, Eden of greenery. One of the displays that went in, they had a whole bunch of things about for a country that was very interested in greenery. Most of the displays in here are about mining, undersea exploration, that sort of thing. But you could go and get these wonderful booklets, and I get a real kick out of these. They would basically force them on you to take one of their booklets, please. So, I know if you look at these, if you just take a moment, that when you go to a World's Fair, what you really want is a souvenir booklet on the system of wet discharge of ionizing seed from the MHD generator circuit. They were just totally out of touch with any sort of public relations sort of thing. The uptake of aromatic hydrocarbons and their metabolism in higher plants. I've got all these, I read them, my brain turns to mush, but this is what they were passing out rather than, they didn't have any cute mascot or anything that was, fun or anything. It was very heavy-handed sort of approach. But then we have the USA Pavilion. And this ended up serving as sort of a de facto theme pavilion when the fair wasn't able to build it itself. Very nice design. If you had been at the Expo 67 in Montreal, you kind of saw the German pavilion look much like this. The idea of we have a fabric roof suspended, giving us a tremendous amount of space underneath. And this was the initial concept, was going to be a much bigger pavilion. And in the center was going to be a man-made urban forest. So like everything else, you design big, you budget, and then you redesign to match the budget. But this was the concept, a giant waterfall falling in the back, water flowing throughout the pavilion. And they weren't able to quite do this, but what they came up with was still pretty good. So we're going into the entrance now. We're going to take a quick look around the US pavilion. The concept here, again, one giant mast in the center of it that would hold up the roof. They spent $11.5 million on this pavilion. And this mast here goes up, see, I think I have some notes on it here. Yeah, 12-ton roof, a 14-story mast. What was interesting, by leaving this giant hole in the center, it basically took care of one big problem. They didn't need to put an air conditioner into this pavilion, because all the hot air would rise and automatically go out through the center of the pavilion. So it was a very popular pavilion. It was 5,500 square feet exhibit hall, 850-seat theater, and everything that they put together, it ended up being the largest pavilion at the fair. This quote here is from Chief Seattle, the Squamish Indians. And this was when the United States government offered to buy his tribal lands in 1854. The earth does not belong to man, man belongs to the earth. And a great quote that you wish some companies would remember today. But inside, as I mentioned, recycling was a kind of new concept. And this fountain here was showing how much water is wasted each year just through leaky pipes, leaky faucets, people just not turning things off. All throughout the US Pavilion, they had displays about recycling, how much water the average American family uses, how much water the American business uses, how much gas the average car uses, how many hydrocarbons that produces. So lots of displays as you went through there. This, for example, is called Trash Mountain. And big display, you can see some old computers and a piece of this and that. And again, in 1974, recycling was very much an exception. I would challenge you to go around your cities of 1974 and look for recycling centers. There was nothing on the side of a plastic bottle to tell you if it was safe for recycling. Glass wasn't being recycled. Everything was going into trash heaps. And this was really the beginning of the movement that we have today. They also had these giant bugs because they were talking about insecticides, that you might want to kill these nasty looking bugs, but you might also just happen to kill all the good bugs. And therefore, if you kill off, for example, all the bees, nobody's going to be around to help propagate your crops. This one, Peter Max was asked to do the official stamp for the fair, kind of an interesting artwork. The way he described it up here, that this fellow here is called the Cosmic Jumper. He is striding across the world, just seeing how everything's going. And off to the right-hand side is a woman he called Cosmic Sage, or Smiling Sage, rather. And she's very happy to see that he's helping to go around and protect the environment. Stamps sold very, very well. It was a real departure from a lot of other traditional American stamps at the time. The colors and just the very different artwork made it very popular. And then this is the pavilion for the city of Spokane. They did not actually do a pavilion. They got together with the Boeing Aerospace Company and built this amphitheater. Great idea was they could do it much cheaper than if they built a building, but they also wanted an amphitheater left on the island after the fair closed. So this way they could get an amphitheater, which the area is still being used today for concerts and performances, and they could have it done in a relatively economic way. You can see how economic they did it, that this was their idea of shade protection for the audiences. And Spokane doesn't get all that hot, although Carol and I would disagree with that. We were up there 2-3 years ago, and it was very hot, very humid. So it tended to have lighter attendance during the daytime performances, but the evenings, the same groups would entertain. They'd have 4 or 5 times the number of people they had there during the day. This was the state of Washington Pavilion. One of the big reasons that the whole thing came to be in the first place, as I mentioned earlier, they wanted an opera house. So they built this pavilion. They had a movie inside about a young girl growing up and different travails of her life and whether or not the ecology would still allow her to survive as an adult. But it was built as an opera house and it's still in use today. This is an interior view of people going in and out of the halls. Outside this sculpture, it's kind of interesting. It never had an official name. The unofficial name is Lantern, after a Chinese lantern. It's still on site today, and it is technically and it is legally against the law to climb this thing, which is very popular with people to climb it. And I'll save you all a trip if you climb up to the top. There's a very profane message from the sculptor welded into the top of it, and what he thinks of you for having climbed up to the top of his sculpture. So it's kind of interesting. Looks nice and innocent. When you get up to the top, there's a giant message on why you shouldn't have done that. Kinomat Cinema was, again, something that kind of interesting is it says Decision Cinema. This had been done first time in back in, I guess it had actually been done in Expo 58 and had been basically a lot of different World's Fairs, Expo 67, Hemisphere. The concept is you go in, you see a vignette, and then the audience gets to decide what happens next. So you might say, John comes home from a day at the office and he walks in the house and finds Martha there with his best friend. What does John do? Does he yell out of the house, yelling and screaming? Does he pull out his gun and kill them all? Does he go do something else? Then everybody would vote. And the next scene would then have 3 or 4 options. So you'd have about 4 or 5 decision points in your movie on what you would do, and then those would have 3 or 4 decision points, and you ended up with a very large number of possible scenarios. And it was done that you had live performers that would interact with the people that were up on the screen. So they had some of the films that they had used before at other expos that they refilmed the same scenes again so they could use locally hired actors to entertain. They also made a big thing of the fact that they had a tremendous art gallery there at the fair. They spent a lot of time and money, and they went around basically to American and Canadian museums asking if they would bring in pieces of art for loan. So there were 146 different pieces. I think something by Remington was one of the most famous pieces that was there. But it was a very well-received thing for showing that everything has to be culture or ecology rather, but you could do a cultural display as well. This is kind of interesting. You had a couple state exhibits. This was the state of Idaho's first exhibit. It's not real exciting, is it? You walk in, you see a bunch of giant pictures of people playing golf or things like that. Why you should go to Idaho? Well, evidently it was panned just terribly in the press, absolutely terrible. And the governor of Idaho got so upset, he ordered the pavilion shut, locked, and shut down, had everything ripped out and an entirely new set of displays rebuilt during the time that the fair was open. So it was interesting that somehow nobody did a walkthrough or a preview or saw how anything of this might look or come off before they did it. But it was interesting they spent enough time and money and effort, not just to lock it and walk away from it, but to end up redoing the whole thing. This here is Bicentennial Plaza. This is said to be the first bicentennial display in the United States for the upcoming 1976 celebration. So the original colonies out there, back on the side of the mirrored wall, you can see a little bit of a bicentennial logo. But this was really the kickoff to the whole bicentennial celebration in the United States. Couple commercial exhibitors at the fair. Not a lot. As I mentioned, it was a small fair. You can only fit so many things in here. Ford had decided that they were going to be there early on. They were the first company to sign a spot at the fair. If you look to the left, the dome was very much like the one they had at the 1962 Seattle World's Fair. But inside, they went not just to try to sell you cars, but the whole concept of like this is a pre-made pop-up camper that you would be able to stick in the back of your pickup truck. They focus of the Ford Pavilion was on getting out and doing recreational travel. They already figured people had a car because they needed to go to work. They had a car because they needed to go visit their relatives. They had to go to the market. But if we could start selling people on campers, RVs, different things, and get them out into the wilderness, that was a whole new potential market for them to do so. General Motors was also there, much smaller if you think about GM's massive presence of things like the '64 World's Fair, no Futurama, but they went off and they had things like their modular mobility car. This was something that was going to be built to take a heck of a bang. It was billed as being a very crash resistant car. And they exhibited something that they were very proud of, was called the air cushion restraint system, which today we call airbags. So Expo 74, besides giving us, some ecology things, was also the first time we saw a public display of airbags, which obviously are everywhere around now. This was an interesting one for Northwest Orient, the airline. If you're an airline, what do? You use a ship to sell your services, right? Well, it seems like a sort of silly thing, but it turned out to be a massive coup on their part, because this was very colorful Chinese junk. It had been built in 1925 as a fishing boat, sailed in Hong Kong. A airline pilot bought it, turned it into a private yacht in 1964, and it had fallen into disrepair. So Northwest Orient bought it, parked it there. They had a little kiosk that you could see off to the side. But because it had these bright red sails, it became very, very popular. As you go through amateur photos of the fair, lots and lots of pictures of the Northwest Orient junk. It was just a real eye catcher. Um, After the fair, it fell back into disrepair, was almost in danger of being scrapped. Somebody bought it in 2002, restored it, and it's still sailing around today, but the sails no longer say Northwest Orient. Kodak had been at every World's Fair since the World Columbia Exposition of 1893, and they were determined not to be let out of this one. And they were very proud of this pavilion as being ecological friendly. It was basically air held the roof up. They talked about how they could take this pavilion down and repurpose it for other purposes at a minimal cost to the ecology in terms of wasted materials. And of course, they made sure it was in the bright Kodak colors. This is kind of interesting thing here, this channel that they had put through the river. Originally, the island had been a standalone island, and over the years, they had backfilled part of one of the sides of the island to give them more space for industrial purposes and for their hydroelectric facilities. And the island had become a peninsula. So what they did was they put this island, they called it theme, or this, not the island, they put this little theme through there, they called it theme stream, to symbolically restore the island as an island, and to show that man can undo some of the things he's done to the environment. African American Pavilion had a very well received film on the travails of the African American population. I think it was the first such pavilion at a World's Fair. You can see from the line here, it was very well received. And I'm trying to remember the name of the organization that did it. It escapes me at the moment, but it was a local community raised the money. It was a grassroots effort on, again, not sponsored by a corporation, but by basically grants and population. Near it was the train. Union Pacific brought in this train. They bring this to a lot of World's Fairs. It was up again at Expo 86 in Vancouver and that. It was Union Pacific's last steam locomotive. It was the last one running in the United States, and it's 450 ton train. Quite a job getting it there, because one of the things you remember mentioning that they had ripped out most of the rail lines to that area. So they had to put a temporary connection in, bring the train in, and then take it up again after it left. But they had gone on a tour of the United States, convincing people that they needed to come out to Expo, and again, a great way to publicize it. As a train nut, I enjoyed it. Not as much of a religious presence at this fair as at some others. The Mormon Pavilion here is actually interesting. The statue is on land. The pavilion, they were running out of space at this point for the fair. So they actually built it on pillars out in the river, and there was a bridge that connected it over to the fair. By the way, if people are sending messages on chat, I can't get to see them very easily during the talk. I see the little thing pop up. I will look at the chat messages and get to them at the end. And again, if I'm making some horrible mistake, unmute yourself and let me know. Sermons from Science has been at an awful lot of World's Fairs. They use some of the exact same exhibits that they had done at the 64 World's Fair, passing massive amounts of electricity through the body. They had been at 62 Seattle, Montreal. I don't know if I'd care to have pass massive amounts of electricity through me, but they keep doing it. I guess they know what they're doing because I've never heard anybody getting hurt or killed. Every World's Fair seems to have a hodgepodge pavilion. For those of us of the 64 Fair, we had a few of them, the Better Living Center and Hall of Education or whatever. This was the Joy of Living Pavilion. If you had something you wanted to exhibit and you could not afford your own display, you could go to the Joy of Living Pavilion. You could go see things on air conditioning, enlisting in the United States Army, very new things of table and cooking materials. So not a super fancy pavilion, but a way for people, even if you're small, to be part of the World's Fair experience. This was an interesting one. Washington Power in the background, the energy pavilion here was very, very proud of the fact that they were coming up with ways to discover new forms of energy. They spent $1 million in this pavilion, opened it up, and the press started pounding them on it. Why is it all about developing new forms of energy? Why aren't you doing more to conserve the forms of energy we have? And one thing that's interesting is no solar displays at Expo 74. Still sort of a new technology, was being experimented with, but the energy people here did admit that, we were only thinking about the technologies we have today, and they did start revamping their displays to try to be more about the fact we need to conserve energy, not just, we don't need to drill more oil wells, we don't need to dam up more rivers, we need to find a way to be more efficient with the energy that we're using today. So kind of interesting that a energy consortium did a mid-course correction based on reaction to their exhibit, much like Idaho did. This is one I get a kick out of. As my wife unfortunately knows, I am absolutely addicted to root beer floats. So A&W Root Beer had the Sky Float. This is one of 2 aerial tram systems that ran across the ground. It was done by a local company. At the time, it was the largest manufacturer of ski lifts in the United States. Unfortunately, they've since gone out of business. But you could take this ride from one end of the fair to the other and get a nice trip across. The second system was also built by the same company, and this one was very different. It didn't go across the fairground. It actually left the fairgrounds, went down to the Spokane Falls, made a U-turn, and came back. Very popular exhibit, and they went off in these set of three gondolas at a time. They had originally announced that there was going to be a tremendous fun fair. It was, matter of fact, they had come up with a name for it, Universa. It was going to have cutting edge rides. It was going to be the fun zone of all fun zones ever seen at a World's Fair. 21 ride salute to your spirit of adventure. And right up to the end of the building process, they were going and hoping to get it done, and the guy that was going to build it collapsed, couldn't economically build it, and walked away from it. So the fair company was left to come up with a more traditional midway sort of experience. So they didn't have any of these wonderful cutting edge rides. They ended up with things that we're more familiar with from other amusement parks and that sort of thing. And this is one of those rides I can safely say you will never, ever see me on. When Dr. Carpenter took us for a tour of NASA, they had the centrifuge down there they test things on. Not only would I not get on that centrifuge ever, I'd never get on this sucker. So they also had a lot of these small display stands around the fair that you could put your small businesses together. Wayne's Photo Finishing had the exclusive rights to film for the fair, so Kodak could not sell film at the Kodak Pavilion. You could come over here and get it at Wayne's. The Bavarian Garden here doesn't look very Bavarian, does it? It wasn't. And the reason it was designed this way and built this way was to have a lot of floor space in between because they were going to put a carousel in it after the fair. So but inside, they had enough beer, German music playing nonstop, and yeah, I was. You look at this, they could have done a little bit more, shall we say, with some sort of Bavarian thing, but nope, stick a sign on it. That's all we're going to spend, and we'll get you inside because the beer and the air conditioning is going to bring you inside. This kind of interesting story, Pierre Interlude. This fellow here had a restaurant at a lot of World's Fairs. I think I have some notes here. When did he start? He had restaurants at the 62 fair. He had them 64, Montreal, San Antonio. And he was a resident of Spokane. So naturally, he wanted to have a restaurant here. And his big thing was his restaurant was based around onion soup. So you can see it says open and serving now, onion soup, garlic bread, and everything. So you could get a whole French dinner here at the Pierre Interlude restaurant for the price of $3, drinks not included. Very popular. People waiting to go on inside and get their food, and there was a very large patio outdoor dining area in the back. And Pierre was very successful with all of his French onion soup restaurants. They also had strolling musicians all around the grounds. Some troops were hired to be there the entire year. Others, the word got out that if you're a musician and you want a short-term gig, go up to Spokane. They'll hire you for a week, a weekend, or whatever. And that became very popular. If you wanted to be able to say on your business card that I performed at the 1974 World's Fair, well, you might have only been up there for a weekend, but you'd get up there, you'd perform. They had all sorts of steel drum bands, mariachi bands, not just bands. They had jugglers. We before saw the picture of the mime. So they did an awful lot of these just ad hoc, spontaneous things. They built some real temporary stages around the grounds to fit some of these things. They also invited marching bands from every school in the Washington, Idaho area to come in and perform. Just like we talked last week about Expo 86, if your band is marching through the World's Fair, you're going to go, your mother's going to go, your cousins are going to go. So lots to keep people busy. A lot of the entertainment was coordinated by ex-Disneyland people that realized that street performance can really take your mind off being in line. And as a result, they put a real emphasis to recruit people and get them up there. This was kind of an interesting street performer. This woman's name was Evelyn Roth, and she was really famous for recycling things. And what she's doing right here is taking 2-inch wide videotape discarded by local TV stations, and she's weaving this giant canopy, which was later held up on Canada Island as a sunscreen. And her hat that she's wearing is actually made out of recycled videotape. So people could come by and she would expounding on how you could do all of the artwork, and you could actually sit down and try your hand at making recycled art as part of her exhibit. But we're getting to the end of the fair. Everything must go. Spokane generated, I mentioned before we were getting ready for the talk, they probably generated more merchandise per square foot of a World's Fair than anybody else I've ever seen. You could get Spokane everything. Here you can see on this one picture, you could get Spokane balloons. They'd have the sand in it so you could pound on it and listen to it. You could get hats, you could get keychains, you could get medallions, postcards, tie, I mean, everything. And as I mentioned earlier, at the end of the fair, this one company bought it, and so much of the merchandise, and you can still buy it today. But it was kind of interesting. Most of it's very, very nice. They didn't have some. I'm trying to think if I've ever seen anything super, super tacky or poorly made, and I can't think of anything off the top of my head. So Expo 74 generated a tremendous amount of stuff, and these guys overstocked, and as a result, you can still get some big bargains today. But the fair ended, and this pictures Carol and I took a trip a couple of years ago to the site, Riverfront Park. It had already been intended, just like many other World's Fairs, to leave a legacy and to leave a park in its place. And it's absolutely a tremendous park. If you're ever up in the area, you absolutely got to go. It's really nice that there's all sorts of parts of Expo. You can be an amateur archaeologist running around. Oh, there's this. Oh, there's that. This and that. but it's also wooded. It's pleasant. The river is flowing. The mist coming off. It's really nice. It's a great environment. So the U.S. pavilion, they originally had intended to take the roof down. They knew that they didn't have the money to maintain it, but they said, "Oh, let's leave it up for a while." Well, over time, the plastic membrane wore out. They de-skinned it and they sold off pieces of it in little plaques that you could go to souvenir stores and end up with a square inch or so of the roof of the U.S. pavilion. Um, the U.S. Pavilion back during the day of the expo had a IMAX theater. Well, that one is no longer in use, but there is now a new IMAX theater. The bridge that we remember before that they couldn't tear down, they never did tear down. All the little kiosks and the colored panels are still, they're all gone, but the bridge itself is still there. I understand there were plans to replace it with a new one. I don't know if they've done it in the last 3 years or so. Uh, Again, beautiful park. The bell tower is still there. A lot of the old trails and walkways from Expo are still in sight. They've added new ones in. They keep it very well maintained as far as flowers. The trees are in great shape. It's probably what Robert Moses had hoped for the '64 was fair for New York. The Spokane Fair did it for Spokane in terms of leaving a very nice green belt in the middle. Spokane has also honored its fair. This was something they did in 1999, bringing people back for a remembrance of it. This was, again, the Plaza of Nations. I don't know if anybody brought back one of those stolen USSR flags for the event, but this is where those flags had been. And around the ground, it's really nice. They've got these little markers. There's not one for every pavilion. I don't know how they picked which ones or why they did it, but you can go around and find a few of these scattered around the grounds. And if you're walking around with your trusty map or your guidebook, you can envision how things were back at that point in time. And this is, to me, this is one of the greatest inventions America has walked away from. This was invented, this is the garbage goat. And I still think the garbage goat is one of the greatest inventions ever done. It was invented by Sister Paula Mary Turnbull, a Catholic nun. And if you look over in the back, there's a button, a green box and a button. If you push that, the goat starts sucking air and he'll suck in trash. So this was back in the expo days. Your kids could go push the button and feed the goat. Well, when Carol and I were there, I got to tell you, there isn't a piece of trash anywhere around this goat. I mean, I was to the point where I was trying to figure out, did I crumble up a dollar bill to feed the goat? And then Carol said, no, I've got some tissues in my purse. So we fed the goat. But you can go all around that area and there's just no trash to be found. So to me, I think what every city needs to do is get a herd of garbage goats and put them in Central Park, put them in, Griffith Park here in LA, put these goats around because kids will go absolutely crazy to run around, pick up anything that's trash and feed it to the goat. So like I said, I was just in awe that this goat still works. It's a tremendous idea and it's fun. So if you're up in Spokane, bring some garbage with you because you won't find any around there and go feed the goat. Some things are still on site that were not in the same condition as they were during the fair. This is a statue called Totem Number 2. During the fair, it was a fountain. Today it's dry, but it's still sitting there on site. So again, different pieces of artwork in that. This is the last butterfly. The panels have worn out over the years. I think they have another one of these in storage, but this is the one that was at the Lilac Gate, and it's the only one still standing on site. The gondola ride is still there. They've replaced the gondolas with new ones. You can see them there underneath the thing. Word to the wise, the gondolas are not air conditioned. They get to be very uncomfortable when it's hot. And as a result, they will shut the system down when it gets warm. So if it's a 90-degree day, you're not going to be going on it. So do what Carol and I did. Get there first thing in the morning. That's what we're standing here waiting for them to open this particular morning. Get your ride out to the fair, the waterfalls. It's a great ride, and they're new gondolas. They've replaced them since the fair, so you're not worried about riding on some antiquated old system. But it's a great view of going out, and it's a great way of resetting your clock back to the day. Everybody can probably hear my guard dogs objecting that the mail is being delivered. The theme stream is still there. The little plaque off to the side is for Thomas Atkinson. He is the executive architect that did the master planning for the World's Fair site. And very nice that they decided to honor his contribution, not just to the fair itself, but to the park that it left behind for the citizens. The Washington Pavilion is still there, and that little stage out in front, if you remember back with the picture of all the dignitaries and unleashing the balloons, it's still out there. They still use it for performances out on the water. Canada Island, again, different markers, and you can go out there. Very nice green space island out there. Some benches and things that are left from the fair days. And then you can even find a remnant sitting here. And if anybody wants to guess what this is, it's kind of just looks like a warehouse sort of thing. But this is portion of the British Columbia Pavilion. So it's not being used today. There were a number of these buildings. The concrete pad in front had one of those buildings, had been dilapidated and torn down. But it still has the potential for future use. Mentioned the Bavarian garden that wasn't so Bavarian. Well, this was out there for hold a carousel. It was a famous carousel that had been built in 1909. It was at another amusement park that had closed in 1968. The city had been looking to find a home for it. It's now here. When we were there 2-3 years ago, there were signs up about they were looking to rebuild and revitalize it. If there's anybody from Spokane or has been there in the last 2-3 years, they can give us an update. But it's kind of interesting that it's still there. And that's the end of the talk. And again, for my website, and I'll go through the door prize on a moment. But for folks that are new to, I've been doing these talks. It's hard to believe it's 2 months now. Wow, pandemics last, huh? But worldsfairphotos.com/Zoom has the videos for all these talks on it, and it has the schedules. Next week, I'm going to be doing a non-World's Fair talk just for something different. I'm going to be talking about Walt Disney's TV series Zorro. The week after that, I'm going to be getting back into World's Fairs, and we'll be looking at the 1933-1934 Chicago World's Fair. So with that, let me stop the sharing. And let me see. Oh, a whole bunch of chats. Okay. Whoa. Boy, you're making a lot of mistakes. Listen to all those mistakes. Wow. No. Did you go mute? No, I didn't go mute. Hopefully, boy, that would be really bad if I was just talking the whole time to myself. The name of the guy is Stacks of Spokane Memorabilia. I'll have to get his name of his shop. I don't have it here right in front of me, but they run a shop, and like I said, it's just fascinating to go to.
Scott's already replied to that.
What's that?
Scott, I'm Cass. Scott has already replied to my question.
Yeah, okay. The Etsy store. Yeah, but he also has a physical store up in town.
Oh yeah, but I'm in Britain. I'm not going to get there.
Oh, okay, great. So before I lose anybody, just to encourage you to go to my site, I mentioned door prizes, right? So I have a whole bunch of things, and you don't need to buy anything. If you want to go to the site and use the contact me button and send me your an email, I will send you my home address. I don't want to post it online, but I will send it to you. If you just send me a self-addressed stamped envelope to mail it back to you. We have some decals. I was there. I don't know how well that shows up. There, so we have that. We have other decals. Oh, there. We have.
They're not showing up really. They disappear.
I'm trying to get it. Yeah. Okay.
Just hold them in front of your face and they'll show up.
Yeah. So we have things for riding the Skyway ride, and we even have genuine bumper stickers. So again, if you go out to my site and contact me, and I will send you my address, and I will be glad to send this. If you want to buy a book, I'll be glad to throw in all 4 of them with a book, and just have fun at it. So enough sales pitch. I don't do these for sales pitch, as Carol knows. I'm not spending all week packaging up all the orders that I get from doing these. As she knows, I don't spend all week doing anything that I should be doing. So, but what sort of questions or things could I try to answer? Or is first anybody, how many people did go to the fair? Nobody. Wow. Okay. I could have made it all up and nobody would have known. Anybody from Spokane here on the, Kenton Lowe put up his hand. He had gone to the fair. Okay. Or maybe he's asking a question. So Kenton, if you have a question, something you'd like to say, just press the space bar to unmute yourself. And Joey asked a typical question. Are those garbage goats bolted to the ground? Yeah, Joey, because they know about people like you. So now the garbage goat, you only see part
Thanks,
of him
Bill.
because behind, Joey just collects artifacts from fairs, generally scrap metal and things. And I could just see him saying, "Oh, I need a goat." Now the goat is connected to a huge compressor system and garbage collectors and compactors and everything behind him. So the goat's not easy to take, but I mean, again, they are just a great thing. I'm going to duck away for 1 second, see if I can reach over. I should have turned on the fan here in my office because it's getting a little warm. There we go. So let's see. That was another question. Let's see.
Bill, can I ask a question?
Yes.
I don't know if I missed it. I didn't see anything from United Kingdom or anything for a building. Did they not represent themselves in this expo?
No, there were only about 8 or 10 countries that had expositions or exhibits. As I mentioned, it was a very small World's Fair. And you had a couple countries and a couple states, and I didn't go through them all. There were other states and a couple other things that exhibited at the fair that I did not have the time to go into today. But you didn't have a lot of the bigger, like Germany had a big thing. England did not. I don't think France had anything other than French onion soup. It wasn't, again, this was a very, very small fair. I mean, Pamela's a neighbor of mine, basically if you think about this, but if you think about the size of Bee Canyon Park, out here, Pamela, the whole World's Fair would have been about the size, maybe 3 or 4 Bee Canyon parks. It was very small pocket park. And again, people very much saying, "Oh, you'll never pull this off. You'll never get enough people to come. You'll never." And so Spokane was smart. They budgeted for a small fair. They built a small fair and they lived within their budget. And at the end, it turned a profit. And they got the park, they got their opera house, and they got their home for their carousel. And most importantly, they got rid of their giant polluted island smack dab in the middle of the city. So it was a success by every measure: attendance, profit, and end result.
Yeah, very pretty. It was a lovely, lovely looking. It was very nice to be there, I'm sure.
It's a tremendous sight. If you get there to go, I mean, the water running through the river going and everything, and you're out in the middle of the city, but you're walking through the trees and everything. It's very nice. I really recommend a visit there to anybody that's anywhere near the area.
Thank you.
Kenton, if you had something, I see your hand is up. Oh, somebody's door prize message sent. Great. I get some of the stuff out of the house. So go ahead, Kenton.
I know, actually, I was just raising my hand to say that I went.
Oh, you went. Okay. Well, I'm glad we had somebody that went so they could let me know if I goofed on anything.
Oh, it was great.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a real good fair in terms of showing that you don't have to shoot for the moon. You can go and do something that works out. And like I said, the fact that they met all their goals is just phenomenal. Somebody asked today, like, gee, what would have happened if they had a pandemic in 1964 for the 64 World's Fair? That would have been a disaster, obviously. I mean, Dubai is supposed to have a World's Fair this year, and now it's going to be next year because of it. But, luckily they didn't have a super rainy season that year, all the things that could drive a World's Fair out of business. So luckily it worked for them. Any other thoughts, questions, observations? Hi, Z. Good to see you. This is a friend of ours back in Philadelphia, and she unfortunately face planted the other day. So she had not been going on camera because she said it was she didn't want to scare people. So it's good to see you again.
Hi, Z.
Hey.
Okay.
Jason, you have a question?
Yeah, hi, on your, I don't know if you go back on the slides, but when you showed the West German pavilion, it seemed to say Philippines on it. I don't know if
They were side by side. Basically, they were you take a building and split it down the middle, and they had the signs out front. So yeah, and that particular thing, as I was looking at it too, I did notice it said Philippines, but they were basically two entrances in the same area, divided by tenant.
And it almost looked like it was a spelling mistake, although I couldn't quite see too well from where I was at. As if Philippines was misspelled, but I have a problem with spelling the name of that country anyway, so.
Yeah, how many L's and how many P's, right?
Exactly.
Thank God for spell checkers. Jason?
Bill, I was just wondering, we talked a few times, or you talked a few times on here about the pavilions with the open tops and the fabric coverings and everything. What happens, or what happened when it rained? Everything just got wet, or did they have a system in place for that?
Nope, you got wet in that particular area. And some cases, like the 64 New York Pavilion, the New York State Pavilion, actually had a plastic cap over the opening, and they had a giant ring that would collect the water, take it off to a pipe, and dump it off to the side. And that plastic ring is gone, but the pipes are still there. But others, when there's an opening, no, it just got wet, and that was part of what they talked about. It was an environmental fair. It rains, you get wet. Luckily, the weather was very good that year. It wasn't a real problem. But their major thing was they had that big opening so they could get the heat out, because otherwise they would have had to air condition. And it was mostly open to the ground, open to the air rather, at ground level. So it just became a natural. And it actually worked out well. The hot air went up, it pulled other air in from the outside, and it became basically a free air conditioning system for the facility. But yeah, if it rained, you got wet. And it would probably all just go into the broken toilet fountain anyway, so it would work out.
Oh, Bill, John Gregory again. What fairs, after the 74 fair, what fairs followed? I don't recall any fairs between 1974 and the Dubai one coming up.
Oh yeah, there's been a whole bunch of them. After 74, you've had in the United States alone, you had the Knoxville World's Fair in '82, New Orleans in '84. You had the Expo '86 in Vancouver. I went to Expo '85 in Tsukuba, Japan. They've had them on the '93. There's probably, since Expo '74, there's probably been a 15, 20 World's Fairs. But we haven't had one in the United States since '84, and they're generally not spoken about or talked about here. And you don't see an awful lot of advertising. But Expo 2020, which is now Expo 2021, is going to be in Dubai. So they're still done. But just it's here in the United States. Once Epcot opened, people said we don't need World's Fairs anymore, and there's been next to zero interest in doing it. Richard Herring says the park not well developed when I saw it in 2005. Yeah, I think these things go, in cycles. Parks get run down, they run out of money, and then they realize they need to go fix it. I wasn't there in 2005, but it is really nice now. I can't think of anything that I would say from walking around it that I felt was, a negative. I mean, it was well patrolled. It wasn't full of homeless tents or anything like that. The grounds, the walkways were in good shape. Again, it's been 2-3 years. I don't remember exactly the last time we were up there, but it was very nice. Oh, and somebody else email. Great. So I'll keep the door prizes for you. Yeah, I mean, again, it's silly, sort of stuff. I mean, somebody had a whole bunch of these, and I said, gee, I'd like to get one of those decals. Do I need 200 of them? But when I could get 200, I mean, again, like this one was 49 cents sold at the fair. And I think, it ended up costing me, when I got it, a dime or something like that. So I got mine. Now I can get rid of some of the others and get rid of some of the space. So if people can have some fun with it. And a couple weeks from now, I'm going to be doing Expo, the 1982 Knoxville World's Fair, and we'll be giving away Knoxville bumpers, stickers. And if anybody wants anything from I forgot to mention this last week, if you wanted a souvenir from the Expo 86 in Vancouver, I've got a whole bunch of Expo 86. So just when you send me your self-addressed envelope. Let me know what you want, which fair, and I'll give you as much as I can fit in there for the postage that you put on it.
Well, I have a question that I've noticed from the last several presentations, actually. Seems like we sort of, for attractions, rather than shows and exhibits, we peaked at the 64, 65 World's Fair for lots of attractions we rode through or circle movies. And it seems like once you got past 67 in Montreal, that sort of thing is almost completely faded out. I didn't see anything that you would call an attraction, a ride, or a inventive cinema presentation. Is that my imagination, or is that just slowly dying away?
No, it's both true and not true. For the fairs that I've covered, it's pretty much true. They tended to go more to exhibits and rides. But as I mentioned, if people are interested, I could do a talk on, for example, Expo 85 and Scuba. They had some real interesting rides. Some of it I understood. Some of it I still don't know what I saw to this day because it was all in Japanese. But they had some really neat ride vehicles that you would ride in these shows. They also had some innovative cinema concepts. One of them was a real interesting thing where for everybody that's gone to the Fantasmic shows that Disney does, that's what they had done. They had a giant screen of water and things projected on it. But they did have physical rides that you rode through. So they still do a mixture of it. The trouble, of course, with anything you do with a ride is it's real expensive to do. You got to build a building, you got to build a ride. You have to then, of course, have a show that you're looking at for the ride. So most companies these days are going the cheaper way to do a video display, a case of your products, and something real cheap. And also something that they can do at the last minute, because if you have to go and spend 4 or 5 years building a ride for one of these things, most companies probably don't even know what they're going to be selling 4 or 5 years from now. So if you go off and you do a display with a kiosk and bring out some singing dancers to sing a jingle or something, you can do that in the last 6 minutes. And unfortunately, that shows in some of the fairs, that they like the U.S. Pavilion, when I went to Scuba 85, for example, had next to nothing about the United States in it. It was all about Texas Instrument computers, because they were the only ones that were willing to put any money into it, because the U.S. had pulled out of World's Fairs at that point in time. So you could go to some other exhibits and see this wonderful thing, and real and entertaining stuff, and others you come out of it, it was a trade show. So there's still a hodgepodge. But if there was one here in the United States, well, this year we can't go because it's pandemic, but I'd certainly be going. And when I traveled for a living, I was always looking at World's Fair calendar, my business calendar, and trying to make the two of them match. So they're still fun to go to, especially if somebody else is paying your trip.
Well, I'm not saying they wouldn't be fun. I'm just noticing the general change of approach. And I know some of that's because companies don't want to put as much money in, but I was wondering if there were other reasons.
I'd say money. Money is the big one. That's look at the difference between 1964 for General Motors and just 10 years later for Expo 74, and see the difference in the GM Pavilion for one. I mean, the GM Pavilion at Expo 74 would have fit in the lobby for the 64 Fair Pavilion.
Yeah.
So we were lucky.
It was really nice to see how gorgeous the after fair park looks here. What would you say are the next couple of, are there any other World's Fair sites that have equally impressive post-fair parks?
Well, Knoxville has a very nice park. Knoxville was, again, it's again on a broken record. Let's have a World's Fair and build it in a rail yard. And the Knoxville Park is pretty nice today. I'll cover that in 2-3 weeks. But that's nice to go through. The Sunsphere has been reopened. You can go up to the top and look down, and they've got an amphitheater there. Again, a fairly small fair, fairly small park, but it was in very nice shape when Carol and I visited. So I'm just trying to think others. Yeah, so many others just vanish. I mean, Flushing Meadows Park it's there, but I would not say it's a gorgeous park. I mean, it's a well-used park, but I would not say it's a gorgeous park. Go New Orleans, good luck trying to find a trace of the fair. You know, there's some stuff left in Expo 86. Most of them just, you know, they redevelop the land, put up apartment houses and move on. But that's why I think Spokane stands out. It had been designed to be a park. It is a park. And, you know, it's too bad it was run down in 2005, but it's really, when we were there the last time, it was really a very nice day. Other than we hit the apps, they were the record, we're watching the news, it's record heat and record humidity. And we're going, oh God, you know, what a day we picked to go. And then some others, Aichi, I don't know how that one looks. If you go to Osaka, it's a really nice park. But, you know, Osaka, for example, when they tore down the fair, they left up the Tower of the Sun, the theme structure. And he looks very sad sitting out in this empty field by himself. You know, the whole World's Fair is gone, and he's still out there, like, looking for it to come back. And they had been in an amusement park across the way. And I don't think I think the amusement park may have closed in recent years. Oh yeah, somebody mentioned Hemisphere is a reasonable park. That's true. Carol and I were there.
Parking every year, but it's still there.
Yeah, we were there about 2 years ago, and we had a very nice time going through it and playing on the chimes that were left. You could pound on with a mallet and go up to the top and go to the tower and look down. So yeah, you're right. Hemisphere, that's on my list of potential future books, and I keep thinking of forgetting about Hemisphere. So I could do a talk on Hemisphere too.
Oh,
So,
love that.
Bill,
yeah.
You have a lot of grassroots organizations trying to bring back the park in Queens, but they keep running into roadblocks. And now with COVID, it's more of a mountain than a roadblock. And unfortunately, no one knows what's going to happen in a year or 5 years from now because of it. Unfortunately.
Yeah,
you have a lot of small groups who try to rebuild.
Well, I tell you, it's interesting. The Flushing Meadows Park, I had gone to this fair, left in 65, and didn't think about it again until about 1971 or so. I was up at college, upstate New York, and somebody asked if I was driving down to Long Island for the weekend. I said, yeah. They said, could you drop me off in Queens? So I said, oh, okay. So I drove down, dropped them off, and then I had to come back to pick them up on Sunday. And I'll go back and see the World's Fair. And I went in, and there was, I was just decimated by what it looked like in 71. There was a there was a garbage strike underway, and they were taking all the garbage generated in the area and dumping it on the floor of the New York State Pavilion. And I can remember standing there, and I didn't have a camera with me. I would have taken pictures. I remember standing there thinking, this is just 6 years ago that this was a World's Fair. It was full of gorgeous everything. And now the tent of tomorrow was 25-foot high piles of garbage dumped in there. It was astonishing. And the roads were in bad shape. And, you know, matter of fact, there were no fences to keep you from driving around. So I just drove into the park, drove around the Unisphere looking around, and everything was ripped to pieces and in horrible shape. And I left there, I was so depressed that in 6 years it had gone from the world of tomorrow to a garbage dump again, you know. So it's in better shape. That's no, I did not do a talk in Osaka already, but I can put that together. So, you know, I kept thinking that, you know, when this whole thing started, oh, I'll do this for a couple of weeks and then the problem will go away, right? Now I'm sitting there going, well, okay, I've done 2 months worth. Now what are we going to do for the second year of this? So, but yeah, so next week's going to be Zorro. Then I'm going to do the 33 Chicago World's Fair. And then I'm not sure about the week after that. I may do a visit to Disneyland for Disneyland of the 50s. So I'm just trying to decide. They may not all be World's Fairs, but I'm just trying to prove that I have interest besides World's Fairs. We could talk about World War II airplanes, all sorts of things. Baron?
Bill, I'm curious. Did you go to Barcelona?
No, I did not go to Barcelona. I think, what year was that? 92? Trying to remember when Barcelona was. Yeah, you get into the years when you have kids and family and that sort of thing, and then also I changed jobs and stopped traveling so much. So, you know, that changed. A show on Davy Crockett. Oh yeah, boy, we could good Davy. We could all sing along. So, I could.
Or El Fuego Gato.
El Fuego Baca. Yeah.
I mean, El Fuego Baca. Yeah, exactly.
it's interesting. My poor kids, all these Disney things, when, we're trying to sing, particularly my daughter, to go to bed, trying to sing her, and, she's probably scarred for life by being, because first of all, if anybody ever hears me sing, that will scar you for life right there. But I'm singing her, to bed, I'm singing The Boys of the Western Sea, they're a rocking company. And okay, now we're going to do a Fago Baca. Now we're going to do Davy Crockett. So she got lullabied by Disney soundtracks over the years. But I should contact the Discovery Channel to do a show for them. Yeah, sure. I'm actually going to be on, if anybody has a Disney Plus, I'll be on Disney Plus later this year on 2 shows about the building of Disneyland. So I'm looking forward to that. Matter of fact, a couple years ago, I did a thing for a show called Behind the Decade, or Through the Decades. And I wanted to talk about the 64 World's Fair, and I had lost the people's email that I did the show for, and I finally found it last week, and I wrote to them and said, did you ever air that show that I did for you? And they just sent it to me. So I got a real kick at it, because I posted the picture. I'm sitting at the CBS News anchor desk, and they're interviewing me over the earpiece from Chicago. And I've never done one of these things where you're talking to somebody that you can't see, and you're staring at the camera, and there's the lag from the time that they ask you the question to it gets from Chicago to you. So I have a lot more sympathy now for the people you see on TV where they ask a question and the guy stares at the camera for 2-3 seconds, then he talks. Well, luckily they cut out all those little stares at the cameras in my talk. But yeah, it's fun, when these different shows pop up and things. That it's fun. I real quick aside, I volunteer with the LAPD, and I do bike patrol. And one day I rode up on a bike to our meeting point, and one of the officers jumps out and he says, I hadn't even gotten out of my car yet, and he's jumping out with something, hey, sign this. And I said, sign what? And he goes, sign this. And I said, it's a summons. What am I going to sign? It's a ticket. What am I signing? And he goes, I just want your autograph. And I said, what for? And he goes, I saw you on TV last night. And he said, I said, oh, well, what was I on? He goes, well, are you on more than one thing? And I said, yeah, a couple. And then, so then it became known at the station that Bill is the guy that can get you tours of the Disney studios, and Bill is the guy can get you into Disneyland. The next thing I know, I got 200 officers thinking that means free Disneyland tickets. It's no, that means if you want to pay to go to Disneyland and you want to pay me to go to Disneyland, I'll explain everything will go around, but I'm not getting 200 police officers and their family into Disneyland. So my popularity went way up, and then kind of, so, but yeah, I have fun with it. It was funny when there was a show on, I think it was Walt, the Man Behind the Myth, about the Walt Disney biography. And Carol, super fan club, super booster, she's really proud. This show comes on TV, and she's yelling, to my kids, come on, come downstairs, Daddy's on TV. And your kids can really put things in perspective for you. My daughter goes back down, I've seen him on TV. So much for my adoring fan club. So, yeah, I have fun with it. Never going to get rich. Who designed the exhibit in the Perisphere? Norman Bell Geddes, a Futurama. Yes, I believe he was the architect behind Democracy in the Perisphere.
Bill, off topic real quick. Are you a ham radio operator?
No.
Okay.
The code test was more than I got enough of code so I could get my commercial certificate when I worked in radio, but I never went into ham.
Okay. And what's your rank as a Boy Scout?
Eagle.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah. So if anybody wants a presentation on Onteora Scout Reservation, let me know. I'm all set. Yeah, a couple of people. Yeah. Onteora, real quick aside, Boy Scout camp that I worked at, we learned it closed. My college roommate and I went there, took a survey, convinced the Boy Scouts that it had a future, and it's the only Boy Scout camp to ever come back from the dead. And so we're real proud that we got that open. And this year, unfortunately, the virus has thrown us the curve. So this year we're doing virtual summer camp, and it won't be the same, but it also won't have any mosquitoes. So one of my big passions still remains Boy Scouts. My son never decided to go. He tried Boy Scouts, decided he liked volleyball a lot more, so that was fine. I wasn't one of these parents that was going to say he had to do it because I did it, but I enjoyed it. a show about 50 Disney's TV would be fun. I believe I have the largest Spin and Marty. Oh, I'd love to see your Spin and Marty collection. Yeah, I could, again, matter of fact, I do have a talk that I gave on a Disney cruise ship a number of years ago that I found a copy of it, and it's called Things I Found When I Was Looking for Something Else. And it was when I was working on different Disney projects, and I'd go into the vault and we'd be looking for this and we'd find that. So I've got a copy of that sitting upstairs in my night table, and I'll drag that out and show you some of the weird oddball Disney things out of the vault. That was kind of fun. Okay, anybody else? Well, I hope everybody's having a nice, safe time out there and staying
Happy
away.
Father's Day.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's tomorrow. Wow. So, and again, all kidding aside, if people want a silly little souvenir or anything, just get in touch with me. I'm not trying to sell you anything. Really appreciate the interest that folks have in doing these talks. It gives me something to do during my week getting ready for it. It's great to see some familiar faces, and some of you I know in person, some of you I know virtually. But it's great to have a community that you can take your mind off the outside world for a little while and go back to my happy place. So I thank everybody for joining, and next week again, we will talk about The Man Who Makes a Sign of the Z, Zorro, my favorite Disney TV show from the 50s, and invite anybody. Otherwise, in 2 weeks, we'll be back for the 33-34 Chicago World's Fair. So thanks much, and wow, we get to go to lunch early today, Carol.
Thank you, Bill, by the way.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Great. Talk to you
Be
later.
well, Bill.
All right, bye.